Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the fascinating and, let's be honest, kind of painful science behind why we are all so desperately wired to seek approval. We're going to break down the evolutionary biology, some classic psychological models, and of course, the modern digital traps that completely hijack our brains.
So, let's kick things off with a super relatable modern problem. Why does a tiny little notification pinging on your phone or a like on a post trigger such a massive emotional rush? And on the flip side, why does a lack of engagement feel like a literal personal failure? Well, it turns out it's not just vanity. It's actually a primal drive woven deep into the architecture of your brain.
All right, Section 1. The need for approval.
To really understand this digital obsession we all have, we've got to take a quick trip back to our evolutionary roots. For our ancient ancestors, being accepted by the group literally meant the difference between survival and death. Enter Mark Leary's sociometer theory. He proposed that our self-esteem isn't just about feeling warm and fuzzy inside. It's actually a primal warning system. Think of it like the fuel gauge on your dashboard, but instead of gas, it's tracking your social belonging.
The really wild core takeaway here is that natural selection basically hardwired our psychology to sound an alarm anytime there's a threat to our social bonds. When your internal sociometer drops, you feel awful. And that's not just to bum you out. It acts as an evolutionary cattle prod, pushing you to change your behavior and avoid rejection at all costs.
Moving right along to Section 2, the looking glass self.
This brings us to classical sociology, specifically Charles Cooley back in 1902. He had this profound realization that we don't just figure out who we are in a vacuum. Instead, other people act as actual, literal mirrors for us. We don't magically just know we're smart or funny. We rely entirely on this social mirror to reflect those traits back to us through people's reactions and appraisals.
He broke this whole thing down into a really fascinating, highly subjective three-step dance. First off, we actively imagine how we appear to outside observers. Second, we interpret their judgments, searching for a smile of approval or a flinch of disgust. And finally, we internalize those perceived judgments into deep self-feelings, like pride or maybe shame, which then crystallizes into our actual identity.
And I absolutely love how sociologist Erving Goffman expanded on this later on. He brilliantly suggested that we are all essentially actors. We curate these highly polished, acceptable personas for our public life, what he calls the front stage. But our true, messy, authentic selves, those stay hidden backstage, totally safe from judgment, probably just hanging out in sweatpants.
Which leads perfectly into Section 3, why rejection actually hurts.
So what happens when that front stage performance completely flops and we get that dreaded feeling of social exclusion? You might remember this famous kindergarten rule from Vivian Paley. You can't say you can't play. It perfectly highlights just how palpable and distressing childhood exclusion is. But modern neuroscience has recently stepped in to show us exactly why this rejection wreaks such havoc on our systems. Here is where it gets crazy. Groundbreaking fMRI research by Naomi Eisenberger shows that your brain processes social rejection using some of the exact same neural circuitry as a physical injury. Your brain honestly doesn't drastically differentiate between a broken bone and a broken social bond.
Let that sink in for a second. To your brain, being excluded from a group doesn't just bruise your ego, it registers as literal physical pain. The alarm bells ring with identical intensity. Because remember, to our ancestors, social isolation was pretty much just as deadly as a broken leg.
All right, Section 4, the digital slot machine. So take all those deep-seated evolutionary and neurological vulnerabilities we just talked about and drop them directly into our modern digital age. For most of human history, our social mirror consisted of nuanced cues, eye contact, a warm tone of voice. Today, we've replaced all of that with what researchers call quantified appraisals. These are explicit, cold, numerical metrics. Likes, shares, follower counts. The mirror has basically turned into a highly visible, hyper-competitive scoreboard.
And man, does this create a seriously addictive loop. Think about it. We post our curated front stage lives. Then we wait. We compulsively check our screens and bam, we get a little hit of dopamine when that validation finally arrives. And then we just repeat the cycle endlessly.
The reason we literally can't look away is because this digital feedback is totally unpredictable. You might get 10 likes or you might get 1,000. Psychologists call this intermittent reinforcement. It's the exact same psychological mechanism that keeps a gambler glued to a slot machine. Our brains just become hooked on the anticipation of the reward.
Finally, Section 5, Finding Your Inner Compass.
Look, if our self-worth is entirely tied up in this digital slot machine, our identity becomes incredibly fragile. To break the cycle, we have to make an intentional, conscious shift away from externally driven validation. We have to move toward cultivating a grounded, internally validated sense of identity.
So how do we actually do that? Well, based on psychological best practices, there are a few actionable steps to build that resilience. First, cultivate mindfulness. Just observe those cravings for validation without judging yourself. Next, align your goals with your intrinsic values, not the algorithms. Make sure you seek out emotionally safe relationships where you don't feel the need to perform. And above all, practice ongoing self-compassion. Give yourself the exact same grace you'd give your best friend.
Ultimately, it comes down to reclaiming your own internal compass. It's embracing the fundamental truth that you are inherently valuable, period. Your worth is a given, and it definitely doesn't need to be earned through some flawless front-stage performance or a viral post.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to really challenge where you're sourcing your identity today. Are you going to keep letting a quantified, unpredictable digital mirror define you, or will you do the work to build your worth from within? Something to think about. Thanks so much for tuning in.